Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it is, wherever you're watching. We're here at Bristol Airport at Winters Lane South parking spotting area. Today we're going to go through manual camera settings, so let's get into it. So, most cameras nowadays, if not all, and even smartphones to be fair, have the ability to modify the camera settings manually. So we're going to look at shutter speed, ISO, f-stop, aperture. What else are we going to look at? We can look at autofocus as well as frame rate. And we're going to go through what they do, how they work, and most importantly, how they impact your photos. It's not as warm as I thought it would be. So first things first, shutter speed. So shutter speed is effectively the little mechanical door in front of the image sensor opening and closing. So the speed just dictates how quickly it opens and closes. When the shutter is open, it is exposing the image sensor to both light and motion. So a slow shutter speed will let lots of light in, but it also let lots of motion in. So the image has got the potential to pick up motion blur. The quicker it is, the less light it lets in, but it almost freezes motion in time. So especially when you're starting out shooting things like aircraft, because they move so quickly, a higher shutter speed is 100% your best option, because you will freeze the motion in time, guaranteeing you that nice crisp image. However, a slower shutter speed will give you a wonderful bit of motion blur. Or as an EasyJet just about to take off, as I'm sure you can hear. I've never been up here before. It's lovely. It's a lot quieter than I was expecting. I mean, obviously quite a group up there, but everyone's here for the same reason. So yeah, anyway. God, I've really underestimated just how cold it was going to be up here. I mean, the coat was like a last minute thought before I left. But shutter speed, ISO and aperture, or f-stop, and those three combined is what exposes your image, i.e. gets it the perfect balance of light and dark. So it's not too light, it's not too dark, that's your exposure. So shutter speed is basically what gives us light. So when it's dark, we're going to need a lower shutter speed, and as a byproduct of that, we're going to get motion blur, and vice versa. When it's bright, we're going to need a higher shutter speed, but we'll lose the motion blur if that was something that we wanted. So yeah, the higher shutter speed will give us the nice crisp photo, but equally not let a lot of light in. So we may need to adjust that with other settings, i.e. the aperture and the ISO, which we'll get to shortly. But if we do want the motion blur, or it's dark and we do need that lower shutter speed, then we will also need to combat the exposure with the ISO and the aperture. So next up, ISO. So ISO is a number that, depending on your camera, ranges normally from 50 or 100 all the way up to sometimes 20, 35,000 if not more. And what it effectively is how sensitive your camera's image sensor is to light. So the lower it is, the less sensitive to light it is, therefore the darker the image, lowering the exposure. However, the higher the ISO goes, the more grainy or noise you get in your image, therefore the less clear it becomes. So the price you pay for increasing the light of the image is the quality of it. The third part of the magic little exposure triangle is f-stop or aperture. So for f-stop / aperture, you've got to imagine that the inside of your lens is actually the same as your eye, in that it can open and contract. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but I'll put some kind of image to show you what I mean, but when you change the f-stop aperture number to the lowest number possible, it means it's as wide open as possible. Imagine if you were to go from being in really bright outdoor sunshine straight into like a dark dingy room. Your eyes would suddenly go poof, your pupils would suddenly poof, open up as wide as they could to let as much light as possible in. That's exactly what f-stop aperture is doing to your lens. Now every lens is different, and that number, the lowest number that it can do, will change. For example, I've got a lens in my bag that will go down to f2.8. that lets loads and loads of light in. So if you're having to use a high shutter speed, but the image is still too dark, then you can lower the aperture and let the light in that way. Does that make sense? So it's all about combining the 3 different settings to get the level of light that you need, and then combating a setting you might make for a style, i.e. a low shutter speed, to also get what you need. So as with all of these things, so shutter speed lets light in but gives you motion blur. ISO gives you more fake light that isn't there, so to speak, but gives you noise and grain. So it's not actually a downside with aperture, but the lower the f-stop, the shallower your depth of field, it's called, so the blurrier the background. So when you're shooting big objects, it can actually be, so with an aircraft for example, you could actually have parts that are in focus and parts that aren't. So I would always say that shooting planes, you need to be looking for an aperture no lower than sort of 5 or 6, 5.4, depending on what your lens stops down in. Hopefully you can see the EasyJet behind me. So yeah, with planes, looking at an aperture of sort of around f5.4 upwards, f6, f7.1 probably, then that way you're guaranteed the whole plane to be in focus that way. Right, I'm just gonna go on a little explore on foot, because it looks like on the map that Winters Lane, I mean, I'm sure if you're watching this and you've been here, you'll know the answer to this question. But yeah, sort of going on a little adventure. Just got walking past what would be the 2.7 localizer there somewhere. I can't quite make out the screen. So I'm like a at the moment. It's brilliant. But yeah, hopefully that the first 3 settings, the shutter speed, ISO and aperture, all make sense, and how they all come together to make exposure. Outside of shutter speed, ISO and aperture though, there is other settings that arguably have just an important impact on the image that you get as a result. The next one that we're going to cover is frames per second. Of course, all flaccid. There's the Eastern just departing there. I think that's Amsterdam from here, isn't it? Might be wrong. So yeah, in theory, if it stays like this, which is incredibly just quiet and easy to get to, we should be able to get right up to them taxiing, which would be really, really cool. Frames per second is effectively how many photos the camera can take in a second. It is what it says on the tin. Yeah, this varies massively depending on the camera that you have. It could be anything from 3 or 4 up to 20 plus. So when you're working with planes, the more pictures you can take, the more pictures you take in a second, the more you have in total. You have a far higher chance of having one that is perfectly framed, perfectly in focus, perfect angle, all of that. So whatever the highest setting that your camera can handle, set that one. It's a Jet 273. It doesn't necessarily change individual images, but it just gives you a far higher chance of getting one that you are absolutely delighted with. Seems like we've just hit a bit of a lull. There should be a EasyJet A320 pushing back any second now, according to flight radar, so I will hang on because I'd love to get a shot of it coming up the taxi. That's the taxiway, literally just coming along there behind me. So hopefully I'll be able to get that. That is an A321 just about to head to Paphos, and I think it would be rude if I left now and didn't get this one. Oh, that was worth the wait. I wasn't expecting 2 for the price of 1. Buy one, get one free. Anyway, let's talk about focal length. Now, focal length is effectively the numbers, I don't know if you can see that, the numbers that you see on top of your lens. Everyone's pretty familiar with what they are. The smaller it is, the wider it is, the longer it is, the further you can zoom. Simple. So this is a wide focal. This is not. So obviously the actual location where you're plane spotting from will effectively dictate which focal length you need. Today I've got a 70 to 300 on. And that's a pretty versatile 70 in the scheme of spotting at an airport when you're not actually the right side of the fence. 70 is pretty wide, and then 300 gives you that nice zoomed in ability. So effectively that's the simple bit of focal length, isn't it? The bigger the number, the longer it zooms. However, when it comes to setting or choosing the focal length, there is a few things to bear in mind. So the further you zoom in, the more compressed the image becomes. Things look less warped. On the whole, that's what makes an image more pleasing. You know, when you, like the old GoPros, for example, with such a wide focal length, they used to look all fish-eyed. So the further you zoom in, the more you combat that, and the compression makes the background look closer to the foreground, if that makes any sense. So it just makes it all more visually pleasing. However, when you're at a high focal length, movement of the camera itself is magnified a millionfold for every 100mm you go in. So when you're at 70mm, it feels like you can hold it pretty stable, and you can, and the image, especially if you're filming or using low shutter speed for photos, you'll have a relatively smooth movement. However, when you zoom in, or if I were to zoom into 300mm, that my movement, even though it might only be just like a little shake like that, not even noticeable to the eye, 300mm will magnify that shake, and it will look like a massive jolt in the video. Or if you're using low shutter speed, it could be that everything else about the image is perfect, but just that tiny little jolt where it's been magnified by the high focal length, that is what could throw you out. So it's a bit of a must-have to use high focal length when it comes to plane spotting. But it's some things to bear in mind, that maybe using a tripod, or adopting a seated kneeling position, so you've got some rest for your arms, just to help combat that movement that gets emphasized. Certainly more traffic on the road than there is on the runway. God, he's propelling himself to an early grave, isn't he? Jesus wept. Anyway, that should actually cover the very basics of shutter speed, ISO, aperture, focal length and frame rate. So obviously that was a very, very brief overview, and there's so much more to it depending on what you want out of your image. And if you would like me to do more specific videos on any of the settings I mentioned, or all of them, or whatever, any other video ideas that you have, please do let me know in the comments down below. Subscribe if you aren't already. Please share this video far and wide, with your friends, with your mum, your dad, your cat, anyone. It'll be great to build the community. And yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for putting up with me yet again. I will see you all in the next one.